Hello, my name is James Darknell. Welcome to the Product Pitch, Modo Training for Consumer Packaged Goods, or CPG for short. This training will get you up to speed on using Modo to quickly generate realistic packaging concepts, demonstrating the entire workflow from concept to final rendered image. The idea here is to create assets that will be used to pitch a new fast-moving consumer good, a grab-and-go candy container filled with tempting Fruit Bites candies. They're kind of a cross between a Skittle and a Starburst. In this mock pitch, the agency is providing us with an approved product concept sketch. Our job is to make a realistic final render of that sketch. One of the main selling points of the product is its tantalizing fruit flavors: orange, lemon, strawberry, and cherry. We'll begin the course by modeling these fruit elements in a realistic manner. We will then arrange the fruits as laid out in the concept to generate a rendered image that will be applied to the package label later on. Once that's complete, we'll move on to the modeling of the package itself, adding in convincing details, including its colorful label, applied using a layered shading approach. This way, the client can easily make logo or design changes later down the line should adjustments be necessary. Next, using Modo's dynamics, the package will be realistically filled with the Fruit Bites candies. With some added lighting and shading adjustments, we'll produce a simple product shop type image that the agency can use for the pitch. And lastly, the piece de resistance. Combining all our completed package and fruit elements will generate the final magazine advertisement. To fill out the image, we'll employ Modo's particles and replicators to easily fill out our scene in a convincing and compelling way. Before we embark on the series, there's some important Modo skills you should be familiar with. I'm going to go over them briefly here. If you've been using Modo for a while and you're comfortable with navigation and tools, you can probably just jump right into the next video. If not, I recommend you keep watching, and if any parts are still a little confusing, I recommend you investigate them further in the Modo documentation, found under the Help menu in Modo. We got a lot to cover, so let's get moving. Before we jump in and start working on the training, there's a few key skills I want to make sure that you're comfortable with. I'm assuming that you've already mastered the viewport navigation, where you can use Alt to rotate your viewport, Control Alt to zoom in and out, and Shift Alt to pan your view. If you set up something like the Maya shortcut navigation, then I'm assuming you're already comfortable with that. So I also want to show you a couple of quick shortcuts that you can jump your view around. So if you have some elements in your scene, you can hit A to frame those within the viewport. You can select a certain element and hit Shift A to frame just the selected element. And also you can hit Control Shift A to orient your selection toward the viewport so you can get a better view for that. Also, we'll be moving through the interface, navigating through that. So oftentimes you'll be choosing these different workspaces using the tabs at the top. I personally like to get the little extra bit of screen real estate, so I use the Control Tab switcher. So that is just by pressing Control and Tab and holding down Control. Each time you press Tab, you can cycle through all of the various layouts. Or you can just mouse click over the top of one. And then keep in mind that the most recent one will be the next one in the list. So since we just were at the model one, that's going to be the next one behind us. And you can click and that will just jump us back into that workspace. Another shortcut that I'm going to be using very often is the Control Spacebar pie menu. And this is just our different views within our viewport. So we can jump in and look at a right view, we could look at the bottom view, top. We can look and see what the camera is seeing. And just knowing that I'm going to use the Control Spacebar to bring up that pie menu is an important skill. The next key skill is selections. So you're probably already familiar with the fact that you can click and drag over a series of components depending on the selection mode you're in, and you can select them. Some additional tools that I will be using is I'll be using the Shift Up arrow to grow out those selections, and oftentimes I'll use the pattern selection where you click to select an object, hit Shift to select a second object, and then you can use the up arrow to continue that selection. Also, double-clicking on a selection will grow out that selection to everything that's connected to that element. Same as when you're in an edge mode, you can double-click on an edge to select the continuous edge loop. The last selection I want to talk about is the implied selection. And what this means is that when nothing is selected in your scene, it basically means that everything is selected. So if you were to rotate this element, the whole thing is going to rotate, even though I have nothing selected on there. If I were to make a specific selection and then do my rotation, only the selected elements are going to be affected. The next skill is working with action centers. Action centers are found in this menu above the viewport, and basically these are several presets that automatically position your handle relative to your selection. So if you select the number of polygons and hit W to turn on the move tool, you'll see the handle is automatically positioned in the center of the volume for that selection, the bounding box volume. But sometimes you want to use the selection from a different location. So we can use an action center to say the origin. So now when we rotate this, it's going to rotate that based on the origin of that item layer that you're working in. Sometimes you'll also want them aligned to a specific element in your scene, and that is the element action center. And the way this works is when you select it, you'll see as you hover over certain elements in your scene, they'll highlight. Activate a tool first. So you see that they'll highlight. So they'll have an edge, a polygon, a vertex. So if you click on that, it automatically aligns the tool to the normal of the element that you clicked on, and then positions it at the location where the mouse click intersects with the surface. So now we can move elements based on that position. Undo, we can click there and move them like that. So it's a very easy way to position your handles. The last one that I like to use quite a bit is the local action center. So this one, what it does is it treats local clusters of polygons as if they were individual objects, so you don't need to go in and select them all individually. So I'm using my implied selection that all of these are selected. I'm going to use the rotate tool. And with the local action center, what that's going to do is it's going to find the center point and the orientation of each one of these elements, and it's going to rotate those based on what it is defined as its local little orientation. So that is a huge time saver. It's such a wonderful action center to use. And keep in mind that these settings up here are often just presets. Sometimes you'll want a certain position, but you'll want a world axis. So you can just go in here and change, say, the world axis like that, and then you can position it locally for the center of all those objects, but you can get a different axis on those. So that is working with action centers. Next up is the fall off. So generally when you're working with a selection and you're transforming it, in whichever way you're transforming it, it's going to treat it all as one solid rigid piece. What a fall off does is it lets us control the strength of that transform over the surface of the selection. So the fall offs are found in this menu right here, and what we can do is we can invoke a fall off. Now when we move our plane, you can see that the indicator is showing that it's only working on half of the plane. If we were to select a different one, such as a cylinder fall off, then it's only going to be working on the middle of that selection. So if you want to set up a specific fall off, you can activate the fall off and then use the right mouse button to click and drag and position out. So the wide part of the fall off up here is where it's going to be affecting your model the most, and this skinny part is where it's not going to be affecting it. So now if we invoked, say, the move tool, it's going to be working in that corner up there more than the lower left hand corner. We can hit escape to drop that selection. If we make a selection and we activate, say, a move tool, and then we select a fall off, you can see it automatically snaps the size of the fall off to the position of our selection. So that's a handy little shortcut to understand. So if you activate your transform prior to selecting the fall off, it'll snap that to position. Lastly, what I want to show you with a fall off, get my move tool there, is we have these shape presets. So basically you can see with a linear that's going to move it all in a linear fashion. We can also do this ease in, which will control the strength across the fall off so that it affects it more toward the start and less at the beginning. There's also ease out, which affects it more towards the end than at the beginning. And then there's also smooth, which sort of smoothly attenuates through those two settings. So that is working with fall offs. Alright, so the last key skill I want to make sure that you're comfortable with, and that's working with the work plane. So if I jump back up here to my mesh, you can see we have this white grid by default that sort of jumps around our viewport. And what that does is that defines the orientation and the position of our tools. So say if I wanted to grab a move tool and I click in the viewport, you can see that that move tool is being positioned at the intersection of the work plane and where I clicked in the viewport. But the work plane doesn't always stay in the same position. So we can control that by making a selection, say those polygons, and then we can align the work plane to that selection. What that does is it tries to put the origin of the work plane at the center of the volume of your selection, and then the work plane itself is aligned to the average normals of your selection. So now, if you create an element, say like a cylinder, it's going to be aligned to the orientation of that work plane, and you can select that, and we can say center, and since our center is now at the position of those polygons, that's where it's going to positioning that. And then once you're done, you can reset the work plane and everything goes back to normal. So we'll be using the work plane extensively throughout this training, so it's a good idea to be comfortable with that. So now that we've covered all of our key skills, if there's any areas that you don't feel that you're quite comfortable with still, I recommend you check them out in the documentation, and that's found up here in the help. We have both local documentation that's installed on your local drive and online documentation that's updated continuously. So check any of those out, and you can just do a keyword search for any of the topics that I've discussed, such as selections, action centers, fall-offs, or work plane. Alright, so we got a lot to cover, so let's get working on our tutorial.